Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everybody, welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I am joined by philosopher Michael Huemer, friend of the show, returning guest, to talk about his new book, Progressive Myths. Mike, thanks for coming back.
Thanks. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me back.
Yeah, anytime. Every time you write a book, I will harass you. This is a really great book and also a really fun and easy read. I think, and you say this in the intro, that it will be pretty easy. Even though it's a sophisticated, well-argued book, it's going to be a pretty easy candy-like read, I think, for anyone who's not a progressive or anyone who has feelings of irritation about some of the myths you're talking about. But
It's not hard. It's not hard to follow, but it might be upsetting if you're...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you had written a book called Libertarian Myths, even if it was well written, I mean, I know for myself, it's agitating to constantly read something that's like attacking or disagreeing with views that you hold important, even if it's well argued. Though it's much easier to read things like that if they are respectful in tone and well argued, which I think you are. But I want to read a request that you have for your readers. In the introduction, you say, I have one request for readers, whether you're left wing or right wing or other. Please don't make up views that I didn't assert and ascribe them to me. Don't assume that I am a stereotypical right-wing extremist or that I agree with right-wing people where I haven't explicitly said so. Don't read between the lines or infer what I must be implying. If you think of some ridiculous or horrible political view that you think I'm implying, it's almost certainly in your imagination. I'm not the sort of writer who likes to imply his point, which is very true. I've read you a lot. You're very direct. If you want to say something, you'll say it. But nevertheless, let me just jump to a couple quick conclusions because I'm sure I'm right about this. So You're obviously a big fan of Donald Trump. You wrote this book.
Surprisingly, no. Not a big fan. Actually, it turns out recently my most popular blog post ever became my post attacking Donald Trump. It used to be my post about diversity. Who cares about diversity was my most popular post for a few years. And
so two fairly politicized well, not politicized, but posts that are going to appeal to the left or the right, respectively, on opposite ends became your most popular posts.
That's right. Yeah,
that's nice. So you're not a fan of Trump. You probably don't fit into left-wing stereotypes about why you're not a fan of Trump. But why not? He's a great guy, and you don't like progressive myths.
The way that I think about it is, the reason why I'm against Trump is the same as the reason why I'm against woke progressivism, which is that I want to preserve America. I want to preserve our norms and institutions because I think they're great. The way they currently are is great. Now, obviously, it could be better. And like, if you look at some of my other works, there's like a lot of my works criticizing the status quo, but I don't want to just burn things to the ground. I don't want to just disrupt the whole thing, like sending the bull into the china shop. And I feel like that's what the woke progressives want. They want to attack our norms and institutions in general. And that's what Trump is doing also. Can we have somebody who respects what we have?
Some people might think it's odd that you're simultaneously opposed to Trump and, MAGA instincts, but also woke progressive instincts. That strikes me as less odd than the distinction between being a political anarchist and saying everything you just said about preserving norms and institutions and things like that. Can you say something about that distinction, or is that tension real, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, good. Yeah. So there's a tension between, I don't know, my earlier work on anarchism, on the problem of political authority, suggesting that the ideal society would have no central government. There's a tension between that and the stuff that I was just saying about how our system is great and we have to preserve it.
Yes.
Now, so let me be a little more subtle if I draw a distinction, right? I would like to improve our system incrementally by replacing some things that are not ideal, like incrementally improving them and gradually, and putting in the alternative institutions at the same time that we're shrinking the current ones. Okay, but I would not like to just blow it up. if the way that we arrived at anarchy was by just like the federal government just disappears, just boom overnight, then there would be total chaos. It would be like what people fear from anarchy, right? But it matters how we get there, right? So if the way that we approached anarchy was the government started gradually outsourcing policing to private security guard companies, right? So like instead of having the Denver police patrolling my neighborhood, what if like the people in the neighborhood hired a private security guard company and the government allowed this and agreed with this, to do the patrolling instead. And maybe that would work better. And then like maybe we expand that. And then eventually maybe we don't need government police anymore. Okay. So there could be an orderly way of improving upon the system. And I feel like what the progressives are doing and what Trump is doing is not that. They're not trying to improve things in an orderly way. They don't have a specific thing that's going to be better than our system. And they're not trying to gradually change things. They're just like blowing it up.
I don't have a strong view about what they're trying to do. I think I'm not, some ways I'm not super interested in like contemporary politics because it feels like such a huge time sink of energy to follow. And I think I
Yes.
like reading other things, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
my impression is it's a chaotic mess of like rebelliousness, and some of the instincts I like and some of them I don't. And the first thing that I remember from Trump that ever made me feel like, oh, I'm really skeptical of this guy was just a simple thing in like one of his early giant Republican debates with all the candidates, and someone asked them all, "Will you concede the election if you lose?" And I don't remember exactly what he said, but he didn't just say, "Yeah, of course, no problem." And I always thought, like,
I think he said, "Of course, I will concede if I win."
I will
He
concede that
actually
I won.
said that.
Whatever it was, I thought it was alarming. I don't think he's a person I would ever want to be friends with, but like his brash, ridiculous nature is, I don't know, strikes me more as funny and entertaining. He seems like an entertainer. And just on a personal level, it doesn't rub me the way it rubs other people the wrong way.
Yeah.
But that
Mm.
kind of stuff always did. So yeah, I'm with you there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me jump to some other conclusions. You obviously believe it's immoral to be transgender.
Yeah. No, I think some of the people who identify as transgender, I believe, are confused about their own gender, and you can be mistaken about your gender. They're not all confused though, right? They're like two opposite extreme positions, and the extreme, I guess, right wing position is now it's all fake. They're all just fakers, like
Not
dudes.
just fake, but like wrong and degenerate.
Well, yeah, yeah. You hear different things. Like sometimes you hear, "Oh, it's a mental illness," or they're degenerate, or they're just like lying. They're just like dudes who are lying and saying that they're women so that they can compete with women in sports and win or something like that. And then the opposite extreme is no, anybody is whatever they say they are. Just like as soon as somebody says I'm a woman or girl, boom, they are. And nobody can ever be mistaken. And I have an intermediate, like bizarrely intermediate position, which is actually some of them are confused and some of them are not. Some people are actually born in the wrong body, but also there's some people who think that they are born in the wrong body and they are not.
I definitely want to get into that in more detail. But last conclusion I want to jump to is that you think global warming is a hoax.
It's not a hoax, but it's also not the end of the world, as the activists are saying. Yeah. So I believe, like, no, it has gotten warmer by about 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre
Since,
industrial times. So I think that's real. That doesn't strike me as like a world ending catastrophe. I believe there are significant costs from that, but there are also many other global problems that are of comparable or greater impact.
okay, so let's stay with that one. A lot of the myths you analyze in this book, they're organized by subject, and a lot of them are part of what you would call wokeness, but some are not. This one's not. I feel like the worst parts of the environmentalist progressive movement are maybe more harmful or more dangerous than other parts, or it seems like a more globally persuasive successor ideology to socialism or something with like far-reaching global impacts to shut down human society. Not everyone, but some views in that world. So you talk about climate change, and it looks like your view is that the scientific consensus here is greatly overstated in politically relevant and biased ways. Is there really a scientific consensus? And if so, what is it on?
There's a majority view, right? There's a majority view that there is global warming and that human beings are a significant part of the cause. Now, the consensus has been overstated. So you frequently hear people say, oh, 97% of scientists agree. No, that's not true. What happened was somebody looked at abstracts of articles in the scientific literature, and then they filtered out all of the abstracts that did not take a position. Okay, so they're only looking at the abstracts because there's like many thousands of these and they don't have time to read the papers. Okay, but so they look for the abstracts to see if they express a position on man-made global warming, and the large majority of them did not express any position. So they just filtered those out, and then of the ones that expressed a position, 97% of them seem to imply that human beings were at least part of the cause of global warming. And so that's where they got the 97% statistic. Okay. But in the same year, actually, that study was published, somebody did a survey of the American Meteorological Society. And there, a little over half of the people agreed that human beings were part of the cause of global warming, that it was real and it was largely man-made. Okay. So the percentage is higher if you just look at climate scientists. Okay. But among the members of the AMS, it was like 54% or something like that.
And a majority is not the same thing as a consensus. I don't know what percent constitutes a consensus, but it's surely more than 51%.
Yeah. And by the way, the people, not the other 46%, they were not saying it's not real. They were mostly people who thought, well, we're not sure, so, maybe not. Okay. So that is still a reasonable reason for thinking so still probably the majority is correct, right? It's just not as strong as the activists are portraying it, right?
Or at the very least, I mean, the way I think about it is your judgment is somewhat relative to where you stand and your expertise. So I'm maybe could be able to follow the scientific details of these debates if I devoted a ton of my energies towards it, but I'm not going to. So from where I stand, I will happily temporarily accept a scientific majority opinion or certainly a consensus opinion and just say, oh, that seems probably right. These people appear to be the experts who think and talk a lot about it, and I'll go with what they say because it's not my expertise and I don't have any better source of information. Now, if I was a scientist disagreeing with them, then maybe I would have a better source of information, my own, path-breaking research, but I'm not in that position and most people aren't.
No, yeah, that makes sense, right? So, climate science it's a real natural science, and people study for years in order to become a climate scientist, and I'm not going to do that. And it's not plausible that I could acquire the knowledge that you would get from a 4-year or 5-year or whatever PhD program just by browsing on the internet. That's not going to happen. So what I should do is listen to the people who have done that. I guess, what else do I have? And it's not that those people are infallible. They could be wrong. And sometimes the scientific community has been wrong. That's not ridiculous. That's not a far out possibility, but it is still the best thing that we have, right? As a layperson, that's still the best option that I have.
Yeah. So the real problem seems to be that there's what the science says, there's what actual scientists say or what actual experts say, but then there's a real problem in determining who the experts are, who counts as an expert, and you've got to make some, at some point you can't outsource all of your judgment because you've got to decide, who's at the very least whose summary of who the experts are to trust or something like that. So it goes from actual scientists to, I don't know, textbooks, to science journalists, to popular media talking about science journalists, or to people tweeting about this stuff. And, at some point you have to use your judgment to figure out who to listen to. Yeah. And a lot gets lost along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in this case, it's not that hard because there are people who have PhDs in climate science, but I think there's a problem that people just assume that anyone who claims to know what they're talking about does, and then we can just listen to them. Or when a political activist tells you the science says P, you can just assume that that's true. And no, actually, political activists are some of the most dishonest people in the world. If there are a few professions that are famously dishonest, like lawyer, politician, used car salesman, and political activist. Okay. Those are the most dishonest groups of people in the world. If a political activist says, oh, the science tells us that the world is going to come to an end in 12 years, right? Which is what Greta Thunberg told us, right? All the science tells us. She didn't say the world would come to an end. She said it was likely that we'd be setting off a chain reaction that would lead to the end of civilization. And then if you look at the actual, what the actual scientists said, like if you look at the actual IPCC report, it says nothing like that. It's just like complete BS. It does not say civilization will come to an end.
Why do so many people seem to believe that climate change is an existential threat to humanity rather than just one of many serious problems we face, problems that are real and serious, but nowhere close to existential threats?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's political activists decided to exaggerate the problem to bring attention to it. And so, like, part of what's happening is the political activists think, well, if we tell the truth, then people are just not going to do anything. Like, it's a real problem. It deserves attention, but it's not getting any attention unless we say that it's going to end the world. Okay. And so they start lying about it. And then a lot of them probably they don't even know because they just got all of their information from other political activists. And so it's just like the bullshit is just circulating around this group of activists. And most of them actually think that they're telling the truth because they're listening to each other.
I guess a lot of media people can be considered political activists, but these things get repeated by trusted media personalities who I guess it's obvious if you're looking at it that they are, have a serious political axe to grind.
The journalists don't, my impression is that most journalists are not going to do a bunch of research. So they're going to go to a source and then they're going to interview the source and just report what the source said. They're not going to like do the kind of research that an academic would do, look at competing views or whatever. And also they have a bias towards whatever's entertaining. So, it's like you have a person that you can interview who's going to say, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. And then you have another person you can interview who says, no, like the world is going to continue pretty much like it is. The first person is a lot more entertaining. So that's the person you want.
You've got a little discussion about the many doomsday scenarios, end of the world scenarios that have been propagated just in your lifetime, though I know it goes back forever and ever and ever. How should that history make us approach claims of doomsday scenarios?
Yeah. I think many people don't know this history, right? Like when you hear claims of disaster, predictions of doom coming, most people don't realize that people have been saying that kind of shit forever. Like there have been many times that environmentalists have predicted one disaster or another. And every time they gave a time for the disaster, and that time was before the present, it didn't happen. Right? That is, every disaster prediction that could have been tested was tested and failed. Right. And they're constantly saying all kinds of just like insane things were going to happen. So, back in the 1970s, people were saying there was going to be another ice age, actually. and then they changed it for global warming, right? We were wrong. Actually, it's not cooling, it's warming. Okay. But, and then like all just things were predicted that were supposed to happen because of global warming in the last couple of decades, and they didn't happen. And when you notice that, and, environmentalists are particularly prone to this, but there are other kinds of disasters that people predict, and they almost never happen. So what you should conclude is that human beings have a bias towards disaster predictions. And therefore, each time you hear a disaster prediction, you should think, well, it's overwhelmingly more likely that that is a product of the bias, this persistent bias that people have, and that the disaster is not going to happen because that's the way it was with the previous ones, right? That's more likely than that this time is really different.
And you don't even include, you include plausibly scientific disaster predictions. That's not even to talk about, religious or more fanciful kinds of doomsday predictions about aliens or God or whatever. And those have, of course, been around for a long time as well. So this goes back thousands of years.
Yeah. Religious people have been expecting the end of the world, right? There's the stereotype of the guy with a sign that says the end is near, right? Just, it's going to be some religious person who says the apocalypse is just about to come. And then invariably, as time passes, that guy eventually dies and the disaster never happens.
Are there some kinds of disaster threats, doomsday threats that, it's reasonable to take more seriously than others. I mean, I think about, obviously there have been no times where the world ended and humanity collapsed. But like relative to how bad things can be, I'm picturing like, what if someone was looking at the situation in like 1913 in Europe and was saying, there's an apocalypse coming. And even though Europe wasn't literally destroyed, like in some sense over the next few decades, like that's pretty close to a doomsday scenario for many areas in Europe or in China in the same period or something like that. Basically, I guess the examples I'm thinking of are the rise of totalitarian communism and the world wars seem like as close to a doomsday scenario as I can see.
Yeah, yeah. Good. Yeah. Well, yeah, so it's not like disasters never happen, right?
Yeah.
But they're very rarely anticipated before they happen. The disasters that happen are usually ones that we weren't expecting. And maybe that's because if we were expecting it, we would have prevented it. But okay, so the things that we should be most worried about are things that are similar to things that have actually happened. So if somebody's worried about World War III, that's a reasonable thing to worry about, given that there have been two previous world wars. And like human beings have gone to war many, many times. So like if somebody's thinking, well, what if we go to war with Russia? That's kind of a reasonable concern. Or, to take a contemporary example, there are people who are worried about the threat of artificial intelligence, that AI is going to get out of control and wipe us out. I'm not so worried about the computers deciding to destroy us. I'm more worried about people deciding to destroy us. So to me, the more realistic thing is that some human will try to use AI to kill other humans. And the reason that's more reasonable to worry about is we know humans like that. There are many humans who like, every time there's a new invention, if there's a way of turning it to use it to kill people, human beings are going to do that.
Yeah, that is a general precedent that new technology, new abilities can be turned to pretty rough aims. Even sometimes ones that like AI isn't obviously a weapon, but communications technology in the past have been used to fine tune killing, the use of radio and the Rwandan genocide and things like that.
Mm.
And AI could be like that.
Like maybe they'll use it to design new weapons, better weapons. Maybe
Yeah.
they'll use it to engineer viruses.
Be better at, coordinating military or terrorist campaigns or something like that.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman. Just want to take a quick break to tell you all I appreciate you so much for listening to the show. And it's still a new show, still a growing show. And if you want to help me out, I would greatly appreciate it. Simplest thing you could do is recommend it to a friend and give it a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Their algorithms rank the shows higher, make it more visible, make it more searchable if it has more star ratings, more reviews. So anything like that would be very, very helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate you all. Back to the show.
Okay, so those are some environmental existential threat risks or myths. You've also got myths in here about race. So you talk about is racial bias in police shootings. You marshal some evidence showing that there is not really a tendency in America of police to target unarmed black suspects for shootings, and that if anything, there's a small bias towards shooting unarmed white suspects relative to their levels of criminal participation. That's going to be pretty surprising, I think, to a lot of people, maybe even offensive. What's the evidence for that? And I have a follow-up question about that.
Yeah, good. Yeah, like, this isn't like me just guessing or whatever, opining. Like, I looked at the statistics and they're not controversial, right? Okay. So
they're not controversial among people who study the statistics.
Yeah. Among the experts, you might say, like, just look. So the key is the people who say that there's a bias against Black people are just looking at the total numbers of Black people who get shot or get killed by the police versus the number of Black people in the total population. But the key is to look at the risk factors, right? So look at the rate of Black people being killed by police versus the rate at which Black people are committing crimes. Why would we look at that? Well, because the reason why the police would be making contact with a suspect is usually that they committed a crime, right? And as a matter of fact, like when the police show up somewhere, it's usually because somebody called the cops and said that there was some crime going on. And the person who calls the cops usually reports the physical description of the suspect. Okay, so then if you look at if you look at the race of the suspects who are reported to the police, and then you look at the race of the people, it matches the race of the people who get killed by police, right? So in other words, like if you control for police contacts, the apparent bias against blacks goes away. In fact, it even reverses. So if you look at, the crime rate among black people versus black people versus white people, actually, black people are disproportionately less likely to be killed by police compared to the crime rates, right? So like, black people are around a quarter of the police homicide victims, people who were killed by the police, but they're around 40% of the people who commit homicides, and they're 43% of the cop killers. And so, and the reason that it makes sense to look at that is that that's a reasonable proxy for the tendency to do threatening things to the police that would result in a violent response by them, even in the absence of racism.
And then there's also like laboratory experiments, or I guess you could call them laboratory, but there's also controlled experimental evidence for this. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. They did this laboratory experiment where they have simulators. They simulate scenarios, and they had people act out these scenarios, and then they play them for the cop, and the cop has to respond and decide, the person is going to pull something out of their pocket, which sometimes they pull out a wallet or sometimes they pull out a gun. The cop has to decide whether to shoot or not. And then, so they did this experiment where they did the same scenarios, but two versions of each, one version with a black actor and one version with a white actor. And they wanted to see if the cops were more likely to shoot when there's a black actor in the scenario. And the answer was the reverse of what we're supposed to expect. So the answer was they're more likely to shoot when it's a white suspect. So, it takes 0.2 seconds more for them to decide to shoot a black suspect, and they make fewer mistakes. 14% of the time they wrongly shot a white suspect, and only 1% of the time they wrongly shot a black suspect. So the bias is the reverse of what we're supposed to think.
And your hypothesized explanation of that this bias is actually the reverse of what we normally think is that maybe heightened media scrutiny makes police more cautious about shooting black suspects. If that's the case, I mean, has that been tested? Can we test this by measuring when heightened media coverage starts to be obviously noticeable and seeing if there are changes in statistics prior to inflection points like that?
So I don't know that there's a way of directly testing that. Like the way to test it would be, do an intervention where you make the media stop reporting on the black people, but we can't really do that.
But you can probably find time, there's probably some point in history where there was a significant uptick. If you look at, I'm sure there's ways to look at that. I mean, that would tell you something, but yeah, ideally you'd want to control the independent variable and be able to turn it off and on at will.
Yeah. I mean, so it's probably increased over time, right? But it was probably gradual. So it's going to be a little bit hard to discern. There are cases where police, in fact, report that they're afraid of appearing in the media. And so there's a case where a cop got beaten up by a black suspect, pistol whipped with his own gun, and the suspect fled. And the cop said that he hesitated to use force against the suspect because he was black and because he'd seen all the media attention of cops using force against black people. So, okay. And, it's plausible. Also, there's a lot less media scrutiny for non-lethal use of force. There's basically no scrutiny for non-lethal use of force. But the non-lethal use of force, actually, it looks like the bias is the direction that you would expect. So there's more
like low-level roughing up and, shoving someone into a cop car or something like that, or arrests, contacts, period in general. That bias does seem to be against black people.
Yeah. The black people are more likely to get some level of force. They're less likely to get lethal force, but more likely to get non-lethal force. Okay, now, you could wonder why that is. You might think, oh, maybe that's just pure racism, or it's probably racial profiling, right? That is, it's probably that the cops know that black people are more likely to commit crimes, and that's just factual, right? It's not like they're being racist to think that. That's just a matter of fact. So it's probably that they're profiling.
Yeah, people. And they don't have to come in with a theory about why that is. Like, they don't have to come in and thinking black people commit more crimes because they're genetically predisposed to. I mean, they may have a very progressive view about why black people commit more crimes because, and maybe it's because of a history of oppression or other things or whatever. But nevertheless, that's the facts that they're dealt. Because one response to this is, okay, so the police are not directly being intentionally racist towards Black people, but in some broader sense, we have to push the analysis back a step there because society is mistreating Black people in some other way that's causing a higher criminal participation rate on their part or something like that. And that's the problem we need to discuss rather than this one.
So that could be true, but it's not really the cop's fault, right? So, right, it could be that, well, Blacks are committing more crimes because of a history of oppression, but the job of the cop on the street is to arrest the people who are committing crimes. It's not to worry about the history or whatever, right? And it's like, it's not showing that they're doing something wrong, that they're confronting Black people more often, right?
So another one related to race. Of all the myths in this book, there was one that jumped out at me because it's one I recall being especially taken in by for a considerable period of time, probably because it strokes my libertarian biases. Several of them I think I looked at and I was like, I think I remember thinking this seemed plausible for a while, but the racist war on drugs one, I recall that one felt like a little homier to me. I was like, oh yeah, I think that's something that I bought for a long time. And more broadly, I think libertarians tend to overestimate the impact of the war on drugs in some ways related to incarceration. That's been common. But why is this not true? Why is the war on drugs not a racist project against Blacks?
So I don't know exactly about the very beginnings, going back in the 1920s or whatever, whenever the thing began.
1911, I think.
Yeah. So, okay. But, there were a few big pieces of legislation that stepped up the war on drugs. And it was like one during the Nixon administration, there's one during the Clinton administration.
And Reagan.
And then, and Reagan. And you're like, okay. And so, the opponents of the war on drugs and also progressives tend to say, oh, this is racist. And then, like, an example of this is crack cocaine gets harsher sentences than powder cocaine, and crack cocaine is more popular in Black communities and powder cocaine is more popular with white users. So you think, oh, it must just be racism, like they just hate Black people, right? But what actually happened was, well, crack was devastating Black communities, and Black leaders themselves wanted harsher penalties because the war on drugs was supposed to help, right? Like stepping up the war on drugs and arresting more people and having harsher penalties was supposed to help those communities because the people doing it thought that was going to stamp out the drug problem. When you think about it, it makes sense. Like, why are they doing this? Because they're just evil and they just like to hurt people? No, they thought it were going to stop the drug problem.
I think there was like some significant calling out of people like, if you're not willing to step up on this issue, on coming down hard on crack and these drug dealers, like, you don't care about Black people, you don't care about the Black community at the time in the I think the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, it was the reverse of what people are saying, right? It was because people cared about the Black community. They were trying to help the Black community. That's why.
And your view, mistakenly so, but that was the intention.
Yeah. I mean, we now know it didn't work, right? It did not solve the problem, and it created a bunch of other problems, right? But it wasn't racist because it wasn't attempting to harm Black people. It was attempting to help them. One way that we know this is that, well, these things were supported by Black leaders at the time. Okay, so like the Congressional Black Caucus met with Richard Nixon and urged him to step up the drug war. And then if you look at the voting records, like these big crime bills were supported by a majority of Democrats, and also they were supported by a majority of Black Democrats in Congress.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty good proxy for understanding what the intention was behind this. I mean, I'm sure no one on the woke side is going to claim that, like, the official Democratic Party is all on the side of the angels from their perspective, but it's certainly the relatively more favored side compared to Republicans. So that level of support should make it odd if the intention was to keep the Black community down or something.
Yeah. I mean, these things were generally bipartisan. Right?
I think in some ways, maybe it's easier for a libertarian to understand because the idea that a government program would have unintended consequences, just the phrase unintended consequences is like a stock vocabulary weapon in a libertarian arsenal. So there's nothing odd about that. You don't need to posit malice, even though sometimes it totally happens. It's easy enough to just say, yeah, a lot of popularly supported democratic laws were just misguided and did the opposite or nearly the opposite of what they were intended to do. That's actually normal, not unusual.
Yeah. That's not surprising to libertarians. It may be surprising to progressives, right? It may be that this just didn't occur to them because it doesn't occur to them that laws often do the opposite of what they're supposed to do, right? But we libertarians know that that often happens.
So let me jump to some different myths. You've got some myths related to gender. I'm going to read the myth you have for chapter 15, transgenderism. The myth is all trans women are women. Transgender people are simply people who are born in the wrong body, i.e., their gender fails to match their biological sex. They are never or almost never mistaken about their gender, and they never or almost never change their minds. Anyone who disagrees with this is a bigot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of claims in there, and I'm sure you've got different things to say about different elements of that myth. But what's your issue with this claim? Why is it broadly incorrect?
Well, I mean, in fact, you can be mistaken about your gender, and that's not a weird fringe event. That's actually quite common. So the majority of people who identify as transgender at one time are later going to desist. So, people who say they have gender dysphoria, like they feel like they're not really the gender that they appear or something like that. According to the DSM, something like 80% of them, just like there are different figures that are quoted in the literature, right? But the most common is something like 80% of them are later going to come to identify with the gender that they appear to be based on their body. So this transgenderism used to be very rare, and there's been an explosion of transgender identification over the past.
Sorry, the desistance statistic you just gave, is that from prior to the recent increase in the incidence of transgenderism?
I think it is, yeah.
Okay. So that could change. It's plausible that it could go way up because it's possible that many people, for confused reasons, are feeling attracted to this identity and then will later leave it. But anyway, go on.
Yeah. My understanding of what's going on is, okay, so there's sex and then there's gender. And what is this distinction? Well, it used to be popular for left-wing people to say, oh, gender is a social construction. This is actually not a good view for them, because if it's a social construction, what that means is that your gender is what society assigns to you. So that means that the transgender people are all wrong because they're saying that they're a different gender from the one that was assigned to them by society. Okay, so
they're making it like an individual construct rather than a social construct. They're going against the social construction.
Yes, yeah. But also, whatever. Never mind what's consistent with other progressive ideas, like what is consistent with the evidence. My suggestion is, well, biological sex is in your body. It has to do with the reproductive system of your body. There are two types of reproductive system, and those are the two sexes. Gender is in your brain. And in fact, and progressives don't like this fact, but in fact, there are biologically based differences between the brains of men and the brains of women. And there are systematic differences, right? Which, and these differences wouldn't mean anything to a non-specialist, but they'll be like, oh, this area is a little bit thicker, and like this area has more of this kind of cells, and, in one sex rather than the other, and whatever. Okay. So my thought is, well, and some of these differences are probably adaptive. They're probably designed by evolution for the different circumstances that male and female bodies would face to increase their reproductive success, depending on what sex you belong to. All right. Now, if all that's the case, then you could imagine a possibility that somebody could wind up with a body that is male typical, but their brain could be female typical. Right? There's their reproductive system below their brain, below their head, could be designed in the way that evolution intended for males, but then the stuff going on in their brain could be the way that evolution intended for females,
or at least closer to that.
Yeah. And so, okay, so, that's part of the transgender phenomenon, right? So it's basically just something went wrong during fetal development and the person got a mismatch between their brain and the rest of their body. That's extremely rare. So the DSM is the standard reference work for psychiatrists. It reported a rate of gender dysphoria of something like 1 in 30,000 to 1 in 100,000, right? So extremely rare, but I believe that's a real thing that happens. But then there's been an explosion in recent years. So the other thing that has happened is that some people have just become confused about their gender. Right? It's not plausible that there was so much, underdiagnosis before, and like now, like the true rate was really like 100 times more, right? Because like nowadays, it's something like 1% of people identifying as transgender. So it's a huge explosion.
The typical view for a progressive person would be to say that it is plausible that it was underdiagnosed because it was socially disapproved of, and with more social approval, more people come forward. There's problems with that view too, but why is that not a plausible view, or at least not to explain this degree of increase?
It probably was underdiagnosed. So some of the increase is probably due to greater social acceptance, but 100-fold increase, like that seemed like too much. Right. And plus, they're just like independent evidence that social contagion is influencing the gender dysphoria. Right. There are cases of like, gender dysphoria running in friend groups. Right. So there'll be like groups of teenage girls who come out as transgender together. Okay. So there was one anecdote of, I think it was like 4 girls who were taking a class with a popular coach, and the coach came out as trans. And then within a year, all 4 girls came out as trans. Like, what's the probability of that? Like, I mean, if you suppose that the true rate is 1% in the population, what's the probability of like all 4 of them?
And 1% is probably an overestimate, but even if you go with that, the probability is astronomically low.
Yeah, right. So it's got to be that they're influencing each other. This isn't an outlandish suggestion, because we know that this happens with other things. So we know this happens with anorexia. There's this phenomenon of social contagion, which is like just other people are influencing, and especially teenage girls are susceptible to this influence, being influenced to think that they're fat and to become anorexic. Right. So I think that's a significant part of what's happening. Right. They're literally in danger of dying from starvation and they think they're fat. Like, you wouldn't think that it would be possible for social influence to get people into that state, but it is. And right. And it's not as, it's actually less strange for someone to be confused about their gender, because like your gender is not really directly observable, and like people aren't even really clear on what it is. It's largely dispositional traits, but like most people don't exactly know what the dispositions are. Like, what is masculinity? What is femininity? Like, people are not even going to agree on that. So like, it's not that hard to see how you could think that, oh, you're not very feminine, so maybe you're not really a woman.
My understanding, I'm not sure if you talk about this in the book, is that a large amount of the increase in gender dysphoria or not identifying with your biological sex doesn't come from what we would call like traditionally transgender people. A lot of it comes from what's called being non-binary or something like that. And it's more plausible that you might say, I'm just not sure I feel a strong connection with the usual gender traits, rather than I definitely feel a strong connection with the opposite one. That seems like an easier leap to make. And that's one that I've observed directly quite a lot of times. And that makes sense. If you're a teenager, what's the difference between just being a girl who tends to be a little bit more assertive or something like that, or a little bit tomboyish, maybe might be the old term, versus being non-binary. I don't know if there's any like clear dividing line for how you would draw those distinctions, but I can understand how teenagers would be confused about it.
Yeah, look, I mean, it seems like, like there are a bunch of these stereotypes about what a man is and what a woman is. And I think there are a bunch of people who are confused because they think that to be a man, you have to satisfy the stereotypes of men. And like, no, like, there are different kinds of men. There's more than one way to be a man. You don't have to be like a stereotype guy, right? And similarly for women, you don't have to just like be the stereotype of a 1950s, unicorn loving princess.
It seems like a lot of woke people think you can't really be critical of modern trans activist views the way you just have been, and still be like a fundamentally tolerant liberal person. Why do you think that is their view, that you can't do both of these things? Because I don't see why you can't be totally compassionate and sympathetic and have goodwill towards people, including believing that plenty of the trans phenomenon is very psychologically important and real and meaningful, but some of it is confusion and some of it is unfortunate confusion, and also be a tolerant, kind person. It seems like there's a view that you can't do both of those things, that it's inherently hateful to say some of these things.
Yeah. So, should I psychologize the trans activists?
Would you?
I mean, like, I think there's a couple of things, right? So one is, well, it's easier to go for the ad hominem, and especially if you don't have a case, right? Like if you don't have a way of defending your position based on the actual evidence, and then you know that you have a losing case, then you have to go for something else. So it's easier to just like attack the person who's criticizing your views as a bigot, and then we have an excuse for not listening to them. And then the other thing is that they're just like, there's a temptation to just take a very simplistic view of what it is to support someone. That to be compassionate and supportive is to support what the other person says that they want. Like there's a person who looks like a man and they want to be called a woman. And then you think you're being supportive by just doing that, like giving them whatever they want, right? And that's simplistic, because particularly if you're talking about minors, they could be confused. And like the compassionate thing is not necessarily to just go along with whatever the person is thinking about themselves. If the person is confused about their identity, the compassionate thing is to tell them the truth. Like they might feel uncomfortable or irritated that you're disagreeing with their self-conception or whatever. But if in fact their self-conception is confused, in the long run, they need to know that. That's more important than them feeling comfortable in the immediate near term, right? So like, I think the trans activists, they're the ones who are showing lack of compassion, and they're the ones who are being cruel.
I think in other contexts that what you just said doesn't sound odd or weird at all, and people, conservative or progressive or whatever, would sign on to it. I think if you had a young child, if you were a Jewish family and your young child was very insistent that they just read something on the internet and they're like, well, I think I'm a Hindu now. I'm reading about this. You definitely shouldn't forcefully and forever prohibit your child from becoming a Hindu.
Yeah.
But you might ask them a few questions or show some skepticism. Are you sure? I mean, I'm not sure you even understand our family's religion. What makes you think you have a new religion? Those would be normal questions to ask or to talk about, or, without just immediately being like, okay, I'm going to talk about you as if you're a reincarnated spirit in the tradition of the Hindu faith or something like that.
Yeah. Well, if your kid comes out as having a different religion, that's like in a way less serious, because if they deconvert from the religion, no harm done, right? And like a few years later, they realize that actually they don't believe this stuff. That's okay, right? But people who say that they're of the other gender, like they might wind up permanently altering their bodies. And then when a few years later, they realize that they're not really the other gender, then you let them screw up their lives, getting surgeries, taking opposite sex hormones. And you really don't want to do that if it's just based on a confusion.
Your kid comes out as another religion and they want to get a tattoo commemorating that or something like that. I think you'd have some skepticism, and it doesn't mean that you hate the religion, and it doesn't mean that you hate transgender people, or that you're even totally convinced that your child isn't legitimately transgender, but it makes sense to be skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, like parents might very well refuse to let their kid get a tattoo, and that, like, we all understand that, right? Because that tattoo is going to be there forever. Now, say that your teenage kid just met some guy or some girl that they really like, and then they want to have that person's name tattooed on their chest.
True love, no problem. Go for it.
If you're a good parent, you go, no, you're not doing that. Like, okay. And when you become an adult, then you can do whatever the hell you want with your body. Okay. I'm a libertarian about adults, but I think that children have to be protected sometimes from themselves.
It's not an odd view. You mentioned in the introduction that, some of these myths are propagated by, well, many of them by seemingly respectable outlets, respectable people. And that's why they're effective myths to some extent. You've mentioned that you weren't as interested in the idea of like doing a conservative myths book or something like that, because the conservative myths in general don't seem as persuasive on their face, or the slogan version is the conservative myths are too stupid to be worth refuting or something like that. So this is a compliment to the progressives that you wrote this book. But you mentioned that some of them are persuasive enough that you were initially taken in by them. I was wondering if you could comment more about that, about which, if any of these myths, did you at some point believe or were found most persuasive, and why?
When I first heard the gender pay gap, I assumed that it indicated this like horrible sexism, right? The gender pay gap it's been quoted in different ways, but it said that women earn significantly less than men do for the same work. It used to be said that women earn 59 cents for every dollar that men earned. And then it went up to 70 cents and then like whatever, 74 cents or something. And it's now up to 82 cents. When I first heard some version of this statistic, I thought, wow, like these male employers are assholes. They're just refusing to pay the women what they deserved. And then when I later looked into it, I realized that it was totally not that at all. They didn't control for the occupation or years of experience or other pay relevant characteristics of the employee. And when you control for those things, then the pay gap virtually disappears. I probably thought, initially thought that there was a bias against Black people in police shootings. Then I just did more research and found out it was not true. When I was younger, I thought that it was really hard for poor people to succeed. Like the society is just stacked against them. Once you're born into lower class, you're just trapped there for your life. And I later found out that's not true. There's like a lot of upward mobility in the United States. People who start out at the bottom, after 10 years, they've usually moved up. And so,
yeah, those are good ones. So if someone really wants to avoid being taken in by politically charged myths like these, whether progressive or conservative or other, how would you advise them to proceed? How do you avoid popular views seemingly held by mainstream respectable sources without degenerating into a crackpot conspiracist?
Yeah. Basically you should be more skeptical and you should withhold judgment on a lot of things.
Yeah, agnosticism is always an option. It doesn't feel like an option sometimes. You've got to take a stand, but
yeah, you don't have to take a stand, like if you don't know what's going on, you don't have to say anything. And a general lesson is like if you hear some statistic or some alleged empirical fact that seems to really strongly support a particular partisan viewpoint, you should immediately be suspicious. Like if the thing is so good that it would spread whether it was true or not, your initial attitude should be it's probably not true, right? Or it's probably in some way misleading. Yeah. And so, you should think that even if it's supporting your side, right? So, like even as a libertarian, if you hear about some totally outrageous thing that the government did, your bias is going to be for believing that thing because we have a bias against the government. If it seems too outrageous, you should start to think that's probably bullshit, right? That's probably not really the way it went down.
If you're wanting to go beyond just withholding judgment and actually doing research, it's kind of like a pot shot against people to the phrase, do your own research. Oh, you do your own research. You must be so smart. Nobody can avoid, making some of their own decisions on seeking out sources and what sources to believe. Everyone is doing that. What are some rules of thumb that are helpful for doing that in a unbiased and
a couple of thoughts. I mean, there's some things that are like generally good sources of information. So like when I wrote this book, like I didn't want to put controversial partisan information, right? So my criticisms of the myths are basically from mainstream sources. So like I criticized the myths about global warming and I looked up mainstream climate scientists, like including the IPCC, right? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is like the most mainstream climate consensus organization that you can find, right? Or, when I'm talking about crime statistics, I just look up the uniform crime reports from the FBI. Or if I'm talking about a particular case, like, there's a Kyle Rittenhouse case or the Michael Brown case, look up the court documents. Or, right, for the Michael Brown case, there was an FBI report. The FBI looked into whether this was a racist shooting or whether it violated civil rights. And then they wrote a long report and they interviewed lots of witnesses and they reported what happened. And it's nonpartisan. It's just factually, this is what the witnesses said. And this is the information we have about the witnesses. So, okay. Another thing is, and that's kind of like most people consider that too much work. But another thing is identify people who appear to be relatively reliable sources, right? And so, if you're listening to somebody and they're like highly emotional, that is a bad sign, right? And if you're listening to somebody and they always tell you what you want to hear, that's also a bad sign. Okay, so the people who are reliable, like they will usually not just like pretend that everything supports one side, right? Like everything is on the extreme one side. Okay, so like an example is this stuff about the possible racial bias by the police, right? If there's somebody who's saying, no, there's no evidence of bias of any kind at all, you should maybe be suspicious that maybe that person is biased. But then if there's a person who's saying, no, like they're all totally biased, And what I said was, well, there is evidence of bias in the non-lethal use of force, but not the lethal use of force, which is surprising, by the way, that there's a contrast, but also reality is frequently that way. Reality frequently has pieces of evidence that point in opposite directions. If you have somebody who doesn't acknowledge that, it's more likely that they're just being biased and refusing to acknowledge the evidence that, goes in the direction that they don't like to hear, right?
Yeah, and another element of that, of someone seeming trustworthy and not acting like all the evidence uniformly goes in their direction, is, people who routinely consider objections in the first place and consider them in a way that sounds like you can understand why someone would believe what they're saying. If you make an argument and then when asked to consider objections, the objections are, well, I guess, some horrible racist people might just want to only help white men or something like that. Or if that's the sense you get, which is sometimes the sense you get, that's pretty suspicious. You're like, well, so why would anyone disagree with you? There's no even remotely plausible reason someone would disagree with you. And people who don't present those views are more suspicious to me.
Yeah, so like if somebody basically thinks that all of their political opponents are evil, and it's a large number of people, right? That is not plausible. So somebody thinks that like just Republicans are evil. Okay, Republicans are like half the country, right? Or maybe it's less because there's more people identifying as independent these days. So maybe it's a third of the country. If you think a third of the country is evil, but like your side is not, you're probably wrong, right? You're probably being overly biased. Okay. But by the way, like if there's somebody who thinks just like people in general are evil, including the people on my side, okay, that's reasonable. That might be true. But if you think just it's like the Republicans are evil, Democrats are good, no, it's too partisan.
Yeah, I think a general view that like of emphasizing human weakness and frailty and immorality is a lot more plausible. Also, I think I forget who said recently that, people's political opinions are often the worst thing about them. I don't know if that's literally true, but I like the sentiment because it makes me think of Brian Kaplan's idea of rational irrationality, that the beliefs you hold, tribal beliefs you hold, for most people are just kind of free. They don't necessarily have to mean anything. There's often little to no consequence other than tribal affiliation for being wrong. And that's true of, I hope that I'm better than average, but that's true of me and anyone, So if you're listening and you hate my political views, I'm probably just as nice or, respectful to people in real life as anyone who you agree with, despite the fact that I have horrible libertarian views.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, there's just like pretty good evidence that what's going on when people adopt their political views is not that they're thinking carefully and rationally and collecting all the information, trying to figure out what's true. And when you're mad at the other people for their political views, okay, so the other people are probably doing this somewhat irrational thing, but you're probably also doing it. Right? Interesting factoid is there's significant heritability of political orientation. There's actually a political psychology study that found that there's a genetic component to your political orientation. It's pretty substantial. And so I've forgotten the number, but okay. So, in a way, like that means that you can't blame the people so much, right? Because like, and it's not that there's a gene for a particular political view. The way it works is probably there are genes that influence your general emotional disposition, and your general emotional disposition influences what political views you're attracted to, and then most people form their beliefs kind of emotionally. So
and this is true of religion too, right?
Yeah. So the reason they're wrong is it's not totally their fault. You might think it was partly their fault because they're forming beliefs emotionally, but you should also realize you're probably doing that too. So when you hear an idea and it just strikes you as implausible, okay, so that's probably the influence of your emotional disposition. Or, it strikes you as implausible when it's a thing that a whole lot of people would say is very plausible.
That's one reason that even though I'm not like this at all, I hold politically apathetic people in high regard because I feel like at the very least, they're not doing that. Even people who are like, yeah, my impulses are conservative or progressive, but you can just tell that like the whole thing doesn't move them. I like that. I like that in people.
Right. Yeah. I have an article called In Praise of Apathy, right? Which is about how, it's kind of better for most people to be apathetic about politics. They shouldn't be like working to change the world.
There's a million things you can be passionate about besides politics.
Yeah. Most of the time when you're trying to change the world, you're going to make it worse if you have an influence at all. Most of the time you won't have any effect, but most of the effects that you will have are likely to be bad.
Will you recommend any other books that complement progressive myths?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I liked John McWhorter's book, Woke Racism, but, it's just like talking about how wokeism is like a new religion. It was kind of entertaining. But
No, I enjoyed his book too. He didn't.
Yeah.
Who wrote Hate Crime Hoax?
I'm not sure.
Will Riley, maybe. Anyway,
yeah.
Woke Racism by John McWhorter.
So this is not a book, but there was this documentary called The Trayvon Hoax, something like that, or the Trayvon Martin Hoax, maybe.
Okay.
Which just exposes what happened in the Trayvon Martin case and how the mainstream media narratives were BS. Oh, well, just for a theoretical understanding, look at Kaplan's book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, just to understand how people would wind up having irrational political beliefs.
Sure.
That's good.
What are you working on next?
I wrote a book a while ago called Dialogues on Ethical Vegetarianism, and I'm doing the second edition of it. So the second edition will be coming out next year from Routledge.
I don't know if there's always great reasons to do second editions, but I'm always a big fan of second editions of books that I like, updated examples, etc. And also, I think that for you in particular, for The Problem of Political Authority and other books like that, at some point, if you ever do a second edition, I think my impression is you found a much bigger audience in the intervening years since you wrote that book. So yes. I'm sure there'd be more interest in it. Well, that's interesting. I'd like to read that. I'm exactly the immoral stereotype of probably a lot of people you've argued with. The only element of environmentalism that, if it even can be considered environmentalism, that seems appealing to me is animal welfare activism broadly. Nevertheless, I'm a hypocrite and don't do too much about that. So, there it is. I think you're probably right, and I'm just a bad person. But I have not read that book, but I have read your articles on ethical vegetarianism and some of the calculations you do with very conservative estimates of like animal pain and suffering and how horrible what humans do to animals in factory farming is. Seems unfortunately plausible to me.
Yeah. No, we're causing enormous amounts of suffering every year, which are vastly greater, like, thousands or millions of times greater than the pleasure that we get. But if you get the second edition of this book, then there'll be some delicious vegan recipes in the back.
Okay. All right. And where can people find you?
So I have a blog called Fake News on Substack, FAKENOUS. And also, buy all of my books on Amazon.
Buy all of his books. Go to Fake News if you want all the great articles debunking lefty myths and taking down Trump at the same time. Mike's your guy. My guest today has been philosopher Mike Huemer, and we've been talking about his new book, Progressive Myths, which is a great book, really fun to read. Mike, thank you so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
Yep. Thanks for having me. Been great talking to you.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.